It's good stuff.
It really works. A lot. Yeah. When I saw all right, now I have to take a picture. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first co-ed medical school in the nation. And we're here to celebrate the woman who made that true, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. I particularly want to thank the Upstate Student Chapter of the American Medical Women's Association for hosting this annual event. And this year is particularly special since it's the 175th anniversary of Dr. Blackwell's graduation in 1849. So that's an amazing, remarkable statistic, fact, something we are really proud of. As part of the 175th anniversary, we previously had announced that Upstate was delighted and grateful to receive this wonderful desk and this wonderful chair, 1850, from Elizabeth Blackwell, apparently her favorite chair, even though every time I call her to ask if that's actually true, she doesn't respond. But it is her favorite chair. And we are really, really grateful for this precious gift, which came from Dr. Luque, who in her own right is not just generous, but she is the Waterhouse Professor and Chair of Anatomy and Neuroscience at the Boston University School of Medicine. Really distinguished person. But today, we just want to say thank you, thank you. We're really grateful for this absolutely priceless gift. So if you'd please stand up so we can say thank you. Thank you so very much, Dr. Okay. Apparently her father got this at a estate sale from the great grandnephew of Elizabeth Blackwell, Robert Atwood. So again, very special. We had otherwise no access to it, and really a very, very generous gift. So thank you very much. And today, as we continue our celebration, we have an amazing person as well, Janice Nimura, who has written this Pulitzer recommended book, and we can't wait to hear her. So I'm going to get out of the way and introduce you to Sabrina Sung, who's the president of Upstate's Amway, who's going to lead the ceremonies. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, President Dewan. Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and I am the president of the Upstate chapter of the American Medical Women's Association. Welcome to our annual Elizabeth Blackwell Day event. We're excited to have everyone here today. First and foremost, we really wanted to thank President Dewan and the Office of the President for supporting us and guiding us through making this event happen. I think without their help, none of this would be as extravagant as it is. And I think it really shows the values that we have deeply rooted in the trailblazing woman in our history and how it created the community we have today. In honor of Elizabeth Blackwell, we are so excited to have our guest speaker here today. She received a Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities in support of her work on the Doctors Blackwell, which was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the 2022 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. Her essays and book reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Smithsonian, and so many other publications. Last year, she was elected to membership in the Society of American Historians, and she is currently a distinguished visiting scholar at Wesleyan University. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Janice Nimura.
Oh my goodness. This is an amazing event. I am so proud and grateful to be here with you today. And I have so much gratitude to the people, to Sabrina and to President Dewan and to Dr. Cleary and Dr. Newman, who were so welcoming last night. I may never leave Syracuse. I may be here for good. I'm also the mother of an M1 medical student myself. And so this has an extra layer of importance for me now. I started this project before that was true, but it gets more and more dear to me as the years pass. I cannot think of a better audience for this story. I've added bonus content for you all. Okay, so where to start? I encountered the Blackwell story for the first time in 2015. I was 44 years old. I was shocked that I had never heard of this woman. I went to a proudly feminist all-girls school from age 5 to 18. I was the math science kid at that school. I graduated intending to pursue medicine. I was seduced by the humanities. I was in Manhattan, where they established their hospital and practiced. How had I never heard their names? How was that possible? Okay, so I started to ask around, and I discovered that the Blackwell story tends to be easiest to find on the children's biography shelf. I don't know if any of you found this. There are many versions of it there. This is a chapter book from the 40s. They're very similar. They all feature illustrations of a slim, elegant, well-dressed woman with a stethoscope, bending solicitously over a grateful patient. So this is the 1940s version. This is the modern middle grade version. Same nice clothes, stethoscope, grateful patient. This is the picture book version. Younger, perkier, with little bows in her hair. But there's the stethoscope in the bag, waiting for her to grow up. But the Blackwell sisters looked like this, right? They were never photographed holding stethoscopes. And in fact, even if they had in the 1840s and 50s, when they were becoming doctors, even stethoscopes looked like this, right? So these children's versions were simplified. They were sanitized. They told a story of an icon, one icon, Elizabeth, never mentioning her sister. And all of their ragged edges were smoothed away. And I got more and more curious as I entered the archives and started to listen to Elizabeth and her sister Emily's voices in their own journals and their own letters, and discovered a picture that was much more complicated than those children's books. And I started to become very curious about wanting to represent and reintroduce Elizabeth and her sister to the present, with all of their contradictions intact. So what is that story, briefly? Going all the way back to the beginning. The Blackwells were born in Bristol, England. 8 of the 9 of them were born in Bristol. They came to America as children in 1832. Elizabeth was born in 1821, so she was 11. They were the sons and daughters of a man who was something of a paradox. Samuel Blackwell, the patriarch, was in the sugar refining business. Bristol was a sugar capital. As you might imagine, his industry was based on enslaved labor in the Caribbean. England had outlawed slavery, but they still imported slave-produced sugar. He, however, wanted to change the moral hygiene of his industry. So he dreamed of finding a way to be a sugar refiner while not exploiting enslaved labor. So he came to America with a dream of finding a way to make sugar out of sugar beets. He was an unorthodox thinker in other ways as well. He was a dissenter from the Church of England, and he educated his daughters to the same level as his sons, something that in the 1830s was almost unheard of. So an unorthodox thinker with an unorthodox family. He got his family, 8 of them, with a couple of miscellaneous aunts tagging along, across the water to New York in 1832. He spent a little bit of time there and then moved them all the way out to the edge of the known universe at that point, Cincinnati, which was at that point the frontier, hoping to find a way to grow sugar beets and make sugar that was not tainted with moral sin. He got them all the way out there in 1838, and before they had even finished unpacking, he died. He left his children, but mostly his daughters, with a very clear lesson that a husband is no guarantee of security. None of his 5 daughters ever married. So now you've got there are 9 Blackwell siblings, because George Washington Blackwell was born in New York. We've got 9 Blackwell siblings with no father and $20 to their name in Cincinnati, which is a very small village at the edge of the Ohio River. And this is when they really become a tribe, these 9 siblings. They become very closely bonded to each other, and they're all very well educated. And this is where they become an incredible gift to a biographer, because they love each other deeply. They also drive each other a little crazy. So they're always leaving each other and writing to each other. And this, if you are a Victorian letters nerd the way I am, this is an exciting kind of a document. This is a letter to Elizabeth from her little brother Henry in 1844. This is what's called cross writing. In the 19th century, when both paper and postage were expensive, you filled the page and then you turned it 90 degrees and then you filled it again. And then you flipped it over and you did the same thing on the back. This is actually very easy to read as Victorian cross writing, as it's called, goes. I love this stuff. Most people run from it screaming. But so here are nine people writing to each other constantly. And if you have ever tried to do archival research in the service of biography, you will know that this is a unicorn. Being able to tell a story from multiple perspectives in the present tense is really a precious thing. Elizabeth was born in, I'm getting ahead of myself. Elizabeth was born in 1821. As I said, she was voraciously brilliant. She was socially quite awkward. And she was blessed with a healthy sense of self-worth. She admired, and here she is, a woman named Margaret Fuller, you may have heard of. She was one of the Transcendentalists. She was an editor of the Dial, the newspaper that was their organ. And right around 1844 or so, when Elizabeth was coming of age, Margaret Fuller published a book called Woman in the 19th Century. And in this book, she laid out her argument that humanity was not going to rise to a new level of enlightenment until women asserted their own power. That women could be anything. Women could be sea captains, said Margaret Fuller. It wasn't a matter of sex. It was a matter of talent and toil. And until women did that, unleashed their own power and demonstrated it, humanity was not going to get to the next level of enlightenment. And rock on. This book would have been in the Blackwell parlor. Elizabeth would have read it. And I think it really spoke to her because Elizabeth, as I said, had a healthy sense of self-worth and really began to believe that she could be one of these beacons that could do something to prove Margaret Fuller's point, to show other women and to help humanity rise. So she chose medicine as a strategic choice, not because she loved science, not because she was called to heal the sick. She thought sickness was a sign of weakness. She thought bodily functions were disgusting. When she herself was sick, she tended to hide it because why would she admit it? And she wasn't all that crazy about other people either. She chose medicine because it was an unusually clear way to prove this point about what a woman could do. Medicine in the mid-19th century is redefining itself, both scientifically and institutionally. To this point, it had been more of a trade, the trade of barber surgeons and midwives. Now, increasingly, it was a profession. It was a profession of men, and their credential came by way of a parchment from a medical school. And increasingly, there were medical schools in the United States. So Elizabeth thought, if I can find my way into a medical school and get that parchment, who can argue that I am not qualified as any man to be a doctor? And to be frank, that as an intellectual hurdle didn't seem all that high to her. This is a woman who read the philosophers for fun in her spare time. This cartoon from 1825 suggests that at this point, medical school was not the incredible challenge that you all have tackled or are tackling as today. Medical school in the 1840s consisted of 2 16-week terms of lectures, repeated exactly 2 years in a row. lectures only, observation and note-taking, maybe a little dissection if you were lucky and went to an especially well-equipped medical school. Most of it was this, what you see in the cartoon, a bunch of relatively rowdy young men making light of the human body. Many MDs graduated without ever having encountered a living patient. And as it still felt something like its trade-oriented roots, medicine was what you did if you weren't clever enough to go into law or the ministry. I'm sorry, but that was true in the 1840s. It was a wild choice for Elizabeth to make, not only because of those reasons, but because it was unthinkable for a woman to want to be a doctor. That was unladylike to even want to have a profession. And then the idea that in order to become a doctor, you would have to sit in a room full of men examining the intimacies of the human body. That was just appalling. So any woman who wanted that was either wicked or insane, right? There was nothing else. So getting into a medical school was the biggest challenge that she faced. She knew she could get through it once she got into it. So at the age of 26, she finally won admission to a tiny rural medical school called Geneva Medical College. She had first applied to all of the more mainstream medical colleges, mostly in Philadelphia, in New York, where she was either laughed at outright or they refused to even respond because it was just unthinkable, outrageous that she was asking this question. But at last, she received an admission letter from Geneva Medical College, and she was over the moon. And she immediately grabbed a train ticket to Geneva, and off she went, not realizing the story behind her admission, which was a little darker and more farcical than that. Many of you already probably know this story. In her memoir, written in 1896, 50 years later, she told the story that way. It was a foregone conclusion that eventually I would succeed. I received my acceptance letter, I bought my ticket, and off I went. Yes. In the appendix to that very memoir, interestingly, is another account by a classmate of hers named Stephen Smith, who went on to be a very prominent physician in New York City. He tells a very different story about her admission. One day, the term had already begun. A professor walked into the lecture hall with a letter from a prominent physician in Philadelphia who was endorsing this application from this woman, Elizabeth Blackwell, who wants to come and study among us. And the faculty hadn't been quite bold enough to just say no to this prominent Philadelphia physician. So they punted the question to the students. And Geneva Medical College was a provincial college, right? It wasn't Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. Not only were these boys who had gravitated toward medicine because their grades weren't up to higher pursuits, this was a rural backwoods kind of place back then. Geneva was a tiny town. This was a raucous bunch of boys. The professor turned to them and said, "Boys, we are putting it to you. You will take a vote. And if any one of you does not want a woman among us, she shall not come." And the professor left the room thinking, well, that'll take care of it. We won't have to have said no directly, but it'll be taken care of. The boys, of course, recognizing a spectacular opportunity to make mischief, had a meeting that night, bludgeoned into submission anybody who dissented, and returned a unanimous, yes, she should come, to the faculty the next day. And then they promptly forgot about it. They thought maybe it was a prank being played on them by a nearby medical school. They forgot about it until 2 weeks later when Elizabeth Blackwell walked into the lecture hall and a silence fell like a curtain. Medical school. So this on the left there is a picture of the medical building as it looked on South Main Street in Geneva. That building is no longer there, and it's now a space in the street with this plaque. Medical school then, in these 16 weeks of lectures, you were taking the course of lectures: anatomy, materia medica, surgery, and the normal categories. And for each subject, a different professor's lectures, you would buy a ticket, and this was the way you paid tuition. So this is a lecture ticket for Professor Frank Hamilton of Geneva Medical College, teaching surgery. And there's a nice engraving of the medical building as part of his ticket. These tickets, if you get into archival medical research, are everywhere, and they're cool. This is the lecture ticket of James Webster, who was Elizabeth Blackwell's professor. He was her champion, and she thought of him as sort of her fairy godfather. And he was very jolly and kind of excited about the buzz that she caused. And I kind of adore the skull that he added to his anatomy ticket, because he was a very jolly man, but that skull looks very sad to me. So once she had finally arrived, and the farce was revealed not to be a farce at all, she quickly warmed to the task, and her classmates warmed to her, because it was very clear very quickly that she was working at a level of determination that blew everyone else away. If you wanted your notes to look good, you sat next to Elizabeth. And I think after having decided on medicine from sort of a purely almost strategic point of view, she began to recognize that anatomy had a kind of divine beauty to it. These are her sketches from her notebook of the arterial system and the uterus. I'm sure some of you are now having either flashbacks or wishing that your own notes looked like this. I sure wish I could draw like that. She really became more and more passionate about the technical aspects. She became lost in dissections. I'm grateful to Dan Weinstock. Is Daniel Weinstock here by any chance? He said he might be coming. Okay, he didn't. Daniel Weinstock is an amateur historian, an extraordinary collector who lives in Geneva, and we became friends, and he has fed me more artifacts since the publication of this book that I hadn't seen before. He found this letter a couple of weeks ago, and it's amazing. It's written in 1848 in January, during Elizabeth Blackwell's first term at Geneva, by a Buffalo businessman who was taking a tour of the college. Dr. Hamilton, that's the guy with the ticket that I just showed you. Dr. Hamilton took me all over the college and showed me some of the subjects. One of a man was on the table with arms and legs all off and part of the head. This was the subject on which a lady was operating, underlined, right? She was attending the lecture and learning to dissect the human body. I mean, this was almost like seeing a particularly horrifying freak in a circus. That was the level. Elizabeth Blackwell took lodgings that were 1 or 2 doors down from the medical building because walking the streets of Geneva was difficult. She got catcalled. People gawked at her because she was a freak in their mind. So this letter is an amazing just glimpse of somebody reacting to the idea of a woman bending over a cadaver. Okay, so then she's finished her first term. In between the terms, med students needed to go and find some kind of practical instruction. So Elizabeth headed back to Philadelphia and found her way to Blockley Almshouse, which was at that point the largest municipal hospital in America. Pause to redefine the word hospital in a 19th century context. A hospital today we think of as a place to go to get better, to help. A hospital in 1848 was a place that you went if you had nowhere else to go. Hospitals were warehouses for the destitute, for the insane, for the syphilitic, for the impoverished. Elizabeth found her way to a room that she lived in for the summer of 1848 off the syphilis ward of Blockley Almshouse. From having no clinical experience, she suddenly had more than she knew what to do with. It was her first introduction to the connection between poverty and disease, between venereal disease and the plight of women. When you ended up, I mean, if you had syphilis, that was bad enough. If you had syphilis for long enough, your skull might start to cave in. The condition on the right was known as saddle nose because of the cave in of the profile of your skull. And then you became insane because the cure for syphilis was mercury. So then you had syphilis and mercury poisoning. So she was suddenly subjected to a group of women who were in dire straits. And she learned a great deal from them, about them, it opened her eyes, and it started to reorient her toward ideas about public health. This was not somebody who, I'm going to get off this slide because you don't really need to stare at that. It's not something, the treatment of individuals who were suffering had never appealed to her very much. But this idea of having big ideas that help large numbers of people was very attractive. It was the summer of 1848, so there were also waves of refugees arriving from Ireland and from the continent, also in bad shape, often bringing with them what was then known as ship fever, typhus. Waves of them came to Blackwell Almshouse, overflowing onto pallets on the floor, and she decided that she would write her thesis for Geneva College on epidemic typhus. I think rather pointedly choosing a non-obstetric subject, a subject that was gender neutral. That thesis, as you can see, was published as the lead article in the Buffalo Medical Journal on her graduation in 1849. Elizabeth Blackwell did not just get through med school. She blazed a comet-like path, and everybody was in awe. Then she needed some more practical training. So she did what many doctors emerging from medical school in the 1840s and 50s did. She went to Europe, where the true centers of medical education still were. She went to Paris, which was the best of them, because Paris had an incredible system of municipal hospitals. All of the medical tuition was free. There was an incredible amount of practical instruction at the bedside, a difference in philosophy. She thought, I'll go to Paris. It will be amazing. I will learn everything. And everybody was sort of saying to her, it might be better if you're going to Paris if you dressed like a man, because they're not going to let you in. And she thought, well, that's ridiculous. The whole point is to prove what a woman can be. If I do it in disguise, then my whole project is undermined. So after she went to Paris and quickly discovered that no, she could not gain access to any of the medical lectures. So she found her way here to a municipal obstetric hospital that was designed to train midwives from across France. Young girls, teenagers, would come from all of the departments of France and live at La Maternité and train to be midwives. This was not in her plan. She was 27 years old at this point, had an MD degree. She was not a giggling schoolgirl who wanted to learn how to deliver a baby. But here she could live there and she could gain access to a volume of obstetric clinical cases that would be unavailable to her in any other way. So off she went into a dormitory with a bunch of young girls. It was a place that continued her education in public health, because again, if you were delivering a baby at La Maternité, it meant you had nowhere else to go. Anybody who was delivering a baby and had any money at all, the midwife would come to you at home. If you were here, it meant that you had a difficult life. There were many prostitutes here. There were many women with venereal disease. And it was here that Elizabeth underwent a crisis that changed the shape of her career, if not its mission. She was working on the delivery ward early one morning with an infant who had been born to a woman with gonorrhea. And when an infant passes through the birth canal of a woman infected with gonorrhea, they can contract something called gonorrheal conjunctivitis, an eye infection that today would be treated easily with antibiotics. It's a serious condition, but it's easy to cope with. Then, in the era before antibiotics, gonorrheal conjunctivitis was a serious problem. Elizabeth was washing the eyes of this infant when some of the liquid splashed into her face, and she contracted gonorrheal conjunctivitis. In a moment, having been a practitioner in this hospital, she was confined to a bed, and the fate of her vision hung in the balance for weeks. This is a good moment to pull the curtain on my work as a biographer. The story of this crisis is told in different ways when you look at all the sources. In her memoir, again, 50 years later, Elizabeth wrote of this wonderfully named physician, Dr. Hippolyte Blot, who was her mentor at La Maternité and suddenly was her physician because he was the one tending to her as she lay in her sickbed. 50 years later, she wrote in her memoir, How dreadful it was to find the daylight gradually fading as my kind doctor bent over me and removed with an exquisite delicacy of touch the films that had formed over the pupil. I could see him for a moment clearly, but the sight soon vanished and the eye was left in darkness. You know, he looks like a leading man, right? This sounds like a movie. Fortunately for Elizabeth, her oldest sister, Anna Blackwell, happened to be in Paris at the same time. Anna, as this photograph wonderfully suggests, Anna was a journalist and a drama queen. She was sort of a professional hypochondriac. She was somebody who was always looking into the latest fad, the water cure, mesmerism, seances, whatever it was. She happened to be there though. And so she hustled to Elizabeth's bedside to try and help, as Elizabeth was subjected to all of the horrors of the 19th century pharmacopoeia: leeches, laudanum, mustard plasters, blistering, all of the horrors. Maybe you've learned, I mean, 19th century medicine was, in the 1840s, was the high water mark of what was known as heroic medicine. There was very little way to understand what was happening inside the body. If something was wrong, you basically did as many different things to the body as you could until the bad thing either came out or the patient died. That was medicine. So that was what was happening to Elizabeth. And Anna was racing to her bedside to hold her hand and sometimes wave magnets around and see if she could help that way. And she was writing back to the folks in Cincinnati. Her account went something like, "The pupil presents just now the appearance of one of those little misshapen blackberries of 3 granulations and half dried up that one sees so often on some scrubby little bush. If you can fancy one such in dull-looking lead, you have just the appearance of this poor eye." A very different account. Elizabeth ended up losing that eye. And being fitted for a glass eye that she wore for the rest of her life, although since she never mentioned it, most people didn't know. They just weren't aware. This is a photograph taken after that. If you look at it really closely, you can see a slight asymmetry in her gaze. But that is all you could tell. This is a moment where my awe and respect for Elizabeth Blackwell just skyrockets. Most people would go home for a minute to recover, to get used to being a one-eyed person, to have a disability. No, Elizabeth pulls herself together and goes on to London to continue her training. I don't know how to even process that. I don't know of anybody who would have had such strength. So onward she goes to London, where she lands at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, another municipal hospital full of miserable patients. But during her time in London, she makes a fateful acquaintance. Mutual friends introduce her to a young woman by the name of Florence Nightingale. Now, in 1851, thereabouts, Florence Nightingale was not the global celebrity she would soon become. She was not yet the heroine of the Crimean War, the lady with the lamp. She was a young and attractive woman from a wealthy family who was very eager for her to settle down and get married. And she had all of these big ideas about doing something bigger to help humanity. I like to imagine that her encounter with Elizabeth Blackwell at this stage in her life was something of a catalyst for her career. Here's Elizabeth Blackwell, a woman who has left her family behind, is ranging across Europe with her medical degree in hand, getting medical training. Elizabeth Blackwell is proof to Florence Nightingale that the ideas that she has, the daydreams she has, might be possible. And they become fast friends, kind of ecstatic friends. They go everywhere together. Florence Nightingale brings her home to the family mansion. They stroll the grounds together, talking about what 2 young women would talk about, you know, hospital administration, hygiene. It's quickly clear, though, that there's a difference between the way Florence Nightingale sees a woman and health and the way Elizabeth Blackwell sees it. Elizabeth Blackwell is determined to prove that a woman can be a doctor. Florence Nightingale really believes that a woman should be a nurse. I leave the doctoring to men. It's really the nurses who make the biggest difference anyway. That's what a woman should be. And they have this difference that never resolves. They are in touch the rest of their lives in very different pathways. And there's a degree of tension that starts here and that never quite goes away, which is an interesting side story to this one. Okay, Elizabeth has trained in Paris. She's trained in London. She is trained. She is ready to go back to the United States and practice. And she decides that she is going to do that in New York. where she first came in America, a place that she has fond memories of. She's going to go, she's going to hang out her shingle. It's going to be instantly profitable because there are going to be so many women who are so relieved and delighted to be able to confide their intimate ailments to a woman and not have to talk about embarrassing things with a man. Her professors at Geneva had told her, you know, you're going to be an instant success. Don't worry about you. So she gets to New York and she hangs out her shingle and no one comes. Why not? Well, in 1852 now, the very phrase female physician means someone like Madame Rastel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist, depicted here in the National Police Gazette as a baby-eating demon. A female physician was someone who worked in the shadows, outside of the law, an abortionist. Elizabeth was explicitly opposed to abortion. She believed it was a meddling with the divine that was beyond the pale. And she became ever more determined to redeem the phrase female physician from the likes of Madame Rastel. So here she is, she's in New York, she's becalmed, she's done all this training and she has no patience. It's a dismaying moment. But she has been grooming her sister, Emily, who's 5 years younger, probably the most intellectually gifted of the Blackwell students, Blackwell siblings in terms of science, a more natural scientist than Elizabeth has ever been. Elizabeth has always been more interested in moral philosophy. So she has anointed Emily. She has said, Emily, you shall follow me into medicine, because she needs some company. She needs an ally, and she trusts her own sisters more than anyone else. And Emily, who has 3 rather domineering older sisters and who can feel the power of her own intellect and is curious about where it could take her, says, okay, I'll follow that. You would think that being the second Blackwell sister to seek a medical degree, she would have an easier time getting into med school. You would be wrong. She finds her way to Rush Medical School in Chicago, where she has a wonderful first year and a wonderful mentor who subsequently goes on sabbatical, unfortunately for Emily, who returns for her second year and her second term, only to find that the trustees have ruled that she may not return because they are uncomfortable with her being there. As undaunted as Elizabeth, she pivots and ends up at what was then called Cleveland Medical College, where she finishes in 1854. Cleveland has evolved into Case Western. So she now has a medical degree. It's 1854, and she needs the same kind of practical training that Elizabeth did. And I think, although she has agreed to follow her sister, there is still a little bit of rivalry between them. And rather pointedly, I think she does not go to Paris or London. She goes to Edinburgh, which is the other major center of medical education. And she apprentices herself to none other than James Young Simpson, one of the most famous physicians in the British Isles at that moment. He is, by appointment to the Queen, he is the professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Edinburgh. He, in 1847, discovered the anesthetic properties of chloroform. The tale goes that he discovered those properties by passing the decanter of chloroform around at his dinner table, whereupon his dinner guests burst into hysterical laughter and then passed out under the table. You can tell a little bit from this picture that he was a larger than life, a bit of a showman. But he took Emily on as an assistant, I think partly because he loved the shock value of shouting, Dr. Blackwell, could you come here for a moment? And having a woman enter the room and everybody fall about with shock. I think he enjoyed that. He had a big life. And Emily, but at the same time, he had a lot of respect for what Emily could be. And he taught her a great deal. He taught her the tools of his specialty, things like the use of a pessary in the top image, which would have been applied in cases of uterine prolapse to keep the uterus in place. Something like the uterine sound that was named for him, Simpson's uterine sound, a kind of a graduated probe that allowed you to measure the dimensions of the pelvic of the cervix. He was a pioneer of the pelvic exam, which I think Emily was a little bit taken aback by at first until she realized the power of its diagnostic as a diagnostic tool. She's writing about all of this in letters home to Elizabeth. And you can see in the side of this letter that she has sketched those two instruments I just showed you in the side of, because at this point, her medical career is going better than her sister's. Elizabeth is sitting in New York trying to scrape together a patient or two and failing. Emily is learning at the top of the game with the top guy in Edinburgh. And these letters are wonderful. From the beginning, I wanted my book to be a double portrait of both of these women because I really believe that Elizabeth would not have gotten as far as she did without the support of her sister, Dr. Emily. But the material is lopsided. So what do you do if you're a biographer wanting to make a double portrait, but you have this much information about Elizabeth and this much information about Emily? One of the things you can do, and it's my favorite thing to do, is you can get out of the archive and start following your subjects around. So poor me, I went to Edinburgh, where I started following in Emily's footsteps. This is 52 Queen Street, James Young Simpson's house, and where he had his practice. It's still there. It's the only house in the row with an extra story because his house, his family, his practice, his social life were all sort of bursting at the seams. The day I went there, just intending to take a picture of the building, as you can see, the door is open. So in the spirit of following in the footsteps, I walked in. I think it's now some kind of drug treatment center, so I wasn't totally trespassing, but you get a sense when you walk in the footsteps of historic figures of their sensory lives. And that is very important to the way I write. I try to write history for people who don't think they like to read it. That's me. So I walked in and then you get some details like the back stairs where James Young Simpson's Latinized initials are still in the banister, IYS. That was the staircase that Emily would have climbed to his consulting rooms on the second floor every day. It gives you a sense of what she saw, what she touched. It gives you a sense of Simpson because what kind of guy works his own initials into his banister? It confirms things that you think you're feeling from the documentary sources. I also went to the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, which I highly recommend as a field trip if you ever find yourself there, especially for this audience. Most audiences recoil at the thought of a pathology museum, but I think you all will appreciate it. They had a whole vitrine of Simpson artifacts. They wouldn't let me take a photo, but this was my notebook. They had his pocket pill case there on the left with little compartments for horrifying things like mercury and opium, with a little legend under the lid that said, "Please return to 52 Queen Street." They had his monaural stethoscopes in ivory and rosewood. I wanted to believe that Emily might have handled one of those when she examined a patient. They even had the decanter that they said the chloroform had been in. So Emily is learning at the top of the game in Edinburgh and learning a great deal. It is not, of course, enough to protect her from the same kind of satire and criticism that her sister had received. This is a caricature in the London satirical newspaper Punch in 1856 when Emily was still in Edinburgh. It shows a rather mannish woman in the scandalous costume of the bloomer costume of the women's rights activists, which interestingly, neither Blackwell sister was, peering through spectacles at, of course, the only patient who would consult a female physician, a lapdog, being clutched in the arms of a much more conventionally feminine maiden. Happily, Emily was just as good as Elizabeth was at ignoring all of this kind of silliness. She finally returns to New York and their careers converge at last. And in 1857, Elizabeth and Emily found the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children in a 1823 house that still stands on the corner of Bleecker and Crosby Streets. You can walk by today. This was the first hospital founded by and intended to treat women. The intention was not just to give indigent women free care in the neighborhood, because this was a tough neighborhood, but also to create a place for the slowly growing numbers of female medical graduates to have a place to train, because now there were female medical colleges, one in Philadelphia, one in Boston. They had made Emily's getting into medical school even more difficult because she wanted a co-ed education. And it was harder to try and find that when there were places that only catered to women that she could have gone to. Anyway, they founded this together. Right. So they've got this hospital that's now being funded. They have some donors. They have some patients. They're going along. It's 1857, and as you would expect from two women who founded a hospital in the late 1850s, they had a role to play in the Civil War. So when the first shots ring out in 1861 at Fort Sumter, a meeting is called in the Blackwell's living room, to which many of their prominent donors come. And together they craft this appeal that runs in the New York Times in April 1861, an appeal to the women of New York, and especially to those already engaged in preparing against the time of wounds and sickness in the army. There was a lot of chaotic energy for the Union cause in New York, and it was being misdirected. All sorts of supplies were being sent south and rotting or getting misdirected. There needed to be some organization. So they print this appeal and they say, okay, everybody who's interested in helping out, come to Cooper Union, which also still stands and has a great meeting hall in its basement. Come to Cooper Union for a meeting. The next day, thousands of women arrive in the great hall of Cooper Union to form what eventually became the Women's Central Association of Relief, an organization that then evolved into the U.S. Sanitary Commission. So you can draw a straight line from the Blackwell's living room to the most important civilian organization of the Civil War. And Elizabeth and Emily were placed in charge of the committee that would be identifying and training nurses to send to the front. And it felt for a moment, just a moment, like a culmination, like an arrival at that Margaret Fullerian goal of raising humanity. Because here were female physicians standing shoulder to shoulder with male physicians in the service of a great cause. They threw themselves into their war work in earnest and were fairly swiftly dismayed by the fact that, in fact, male physicians weren't necessarily ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. Their own hospital was left off the list of institutions that were going to be training those nurses. Ridiculous. The leadership role in Washington was given to Dorothea Dix, who you might have heard of. She was not a physician or any kind of medical professional. She was a lobbyist and an organizer. Elizabeth called her the meddler in chief. There was no love lost there. And the Blackwell sisters became dismayed and frustrated, and they eventually withdrew their support from the war effort and let other people do that. And they retreated to focus on a new project. So from the start, they had believed in women studying alongside men to become doctors. They really thought that women's medical colleges were not the way to go. First of all, they were by definition inferior. They were providing an inferior education, and they were producing an inferior graduate because all of the most prominent teachers would go elsewhere, would go to the prestigious men's schools. They had never wanted to found a women's medical college, and they had thought that their own example of integrating medical schools in terms of gender would have been enough to open the doors to women. But that's not what happened. Women's medical colleges were founded, and they knew that they were turning out an inferior kind of graduate because those graduates were arriving at their own infirmary for practical training, and they didn't know as much as the Blackwells assumed they should. So they changed their minds in reaction, and they ended up founding the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary. But they made it was Women's Medical College, but make it better. Their college was 3 terms instead of 2. It was not repetitive, but progressive. It built. And it included practical clinical education at the bedside because there was a hospital, their own hospital right there. It was meant to provide a medical education to women that was at least as, if not more rigorous than what the men were receiving. So that was the climax of Elizabeth and Emily's professional lives together, the founding of the college in addition to the infirmary. Their personal lives were just as interesting. Both sisters adopted daughters in different ways. That's a whole other lecture, and it's in the book if you want to read that story. Emily lived with her domestic partner and fellow surgeon Elizabeth Cushier for the last 3 decades of her life. 2 of their brothers, Henry and Sam, married 2 of the most prominent feminists of the day, I think they were used to having strong women around. Lucy Stone, a suffrage activist and the editor of Woman's Journal, and Antoinette Brown, who was the first woman to be ordained a minister, who they were themselves intimate friends, and they both married these brothers. Interestingly, Elizabeth and Emily did not necessarily agree with these new sisters-in-law of theirs about the women's movement. The women's suffrage movement was going strong. Elizabeth had explicitly refused to join the cause, not because she didn't believe women should have the vote, but because she thought that making the vote the top priority was misguided. She thought you have to teach women to think for themselves before you give them the vote, because otherwise they will take the vote and they will do what they are told with it. And that's not effective. So that's another interesting sub-theme in this story. Being a feminist can take many forms and pathways. And then Elizabeth and Emily didn't always, oh, I'm sorry, I wanted a little more bonus content here. These are lecture tickets from the Women's Medical College. One from Emily Blackwell, professor of obstetrics and diseases of women, and one Professor Mary Putnam Jacoby, who had been a student there herself and was teaching materia medica, what we would call pharmacology. I just love that these exist. They kind of are culminating artifacts. They have the whole story contained in them. So even though they had built this thing together, Elizabeth and Emily not only didn't agree with the women's movement, they didn't always agree with each other about what the role of a female physician should be. Elizabeth, as I said, was more interested in public health. She had lost an eye. Surgery was closed to her. She had begun to lecture and write a lot more than she ever saw patients. Emily wanted to be a doctor, as good as any man, a surgeon, a professor, an administrator of a college. She didn't want to be on a soapbox. She wanted to practice. They had that difference. So once these institutions were founded, they parted ways with some relief. And Elizabeth went back to England, where she had always wanted to return. And she spent the last 40 years of her life there, not really practicing much, mostly writing and lecturing about moral reform, hygiene, those kinds of ideas. Meanwhile, Emily ran the college and the infirmary pretty much single-handedly for decades. And she did it so well that she basically kept her sister's identity out front so effectively that she eclipsed her own, because I hadn't heard of Elizabeth Blackwell. I had certainly not heard of Emily. So that's the outline of the story. And this historical moment in 2024, as we, try to move forward, it feels like a particularly good moment for the Blackwell story. I like to end with this photograph to prove the point. If you Google Elizabeth Blackwell and you go to images, this photo comes up every time. It's a beautiful Victorian cabinet card of a young woman gazing into a promising future, right? She's beautiful. She looks like, one of the March sisters from Little Women or something like that. It is a beautiful photograph. It is not a photograph of Elizabeth Blackwell. I've seen it on the covers of books. I've seen it in documentary films. I've seen it accompanying articles. It's not her. What happened? It's held in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York, and it's cataloged as possibly Elizabeth Blackwell. And the whole story is on the back of the card. Somebody wrote Bessie Blackwell across the top. And I believe that's because this was a niece who maybe went by that nickname. Somebody else trying to be helpful wrote, oh, Elizabeth Blackwell, first woman doctor of modern times. Maybe that was her. And that's how it was cataloged. But like most cabinet cards, the advertisement of the photo studio is on the back, Dana's Photo Portrait Gallery, which existed on 14th Street and 6th Avenue in the mid-1880s. No matter how well preserved, this is not a woman in her 60s, right? And someone's written it, probably not, since Dana is at the 14th Street address circa 1885. It's right there on the thing itself, right? And yet, it persists. Why? Why do we want this to be Elizabeth Blackwell? Well, this is what we want our heroines to look like, isn't it? We want them to be perky and pretty, and we want them to have moxie, but we don't want them to, have grim stares that are indicative of the struggles that they have faced and the way they have tamped down frivolity in their lives in order to be taken seriously at every step. The Blackwells were not perky or pretty. They were not interested in pleasing anyone. They were complicated and imperfect and very real heroines and the kind of people who change the world. So thank you for listening and having me. Right. I think I went a little long here.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Janice. That was so beautiful. And thank you for painting such a beautiful picture of Elizabeth Blackwell. I know we're running a little late on time, so if anyone will take one or two questions, we'd like to open the floor to the audience for if you have any questions for Janice. Dr. Cleary?
How did Billy start from having 20 dollars and all of these 9 siblings be so successful?
If people didn't hear that, how do you go from being left fatherless with $20 to becoming a successful family? I clearly need to put more of the finances in this talk because I get that question every time. The daughters opened a school in their living room to keep the family afloat. Then as their brothers became old enough to get jobs as clerks, they supported themselves that way. They had some support from a cousin back in England named Kenyon Blackwell, who had made a fortune in the iron industry. So that was another step. Elizabeth and Emily both eventually left home to teach in Kentucky, in North Carolina, in South Carolina, made money that way, scraped together enough to get going. Once they came back to found the hospital, they had donations because even though there weren't people who wanted to be treated by them, there were people who liked the idea of them and would support them. And then once the hospital was open, the state also came in to support. But money was never far from their minds. They were never at ease and they hated fundraising. They called it push. They hated having to push all the time. They were not people. Fundraising is an art that requires a certain amount of glad handing, and they didn't have it. And so they thought about money constantly. It is a constant thread through everything they wrote.
I'm assuming that they were not the only female physicians who had a primarily female patient population, and primarily indigent women. Was that in fact true, that this was the role of women physicians to take care of poor women? And if so, when, if ever, did that change?
Well, certainly when they started, those were the only people who would consult them. The Civil War changed that to a certain extent because women were nursing men in extremis. There was even one or two, famous women who came out of the Civil War as having done much more than just nurse. I should have a better answer to the question of when was it normal for a female physician to have male patients. I suspect it's something horrifying like the 70s, Yeah. But what's that? It was still iffy. Right. There you go.
Were there any male physicians who either practiced in their hospital or taught in their college?
Yes. They believed so strongly in excellence as a guiding principle here that they weren't going to stand on ceremony and insist that all the professors be women because then it wouldn't be as good. So there were a lot of people coming over from Bellevue. They had a whole kind of sympathetic ally squad at Bellevue that came and did some teaching, did some consulting, sort of, even their own patients sometimes doubted their diagnoses and they would sort of be backed up by a friendly man from Bellevue to say, no, they're telling you the right thing, Yeah, so there was definitely, although they were hoping to move away from that, but they were very pragmatic about the fact that at this point, we're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot and have something inferior just because of this idealism. And then we'll take that question.
Just curious if their medical school survived with Flexner report.
Their medical school, so the Flexner report, everybody familiar with that in 1910, the Flexner report, established a baseline for medical education. The women's medical, it's a good question. The Women's Medical College was closed in 1899, very intentionally, because 1899 was the year that Cornell started to admit women, and Johns Hopkins. Emily Blackwell felt that the college existed because there was nowhere high quality for a talented woman to study medicine. As soon as there was, she shut the college down, like that. she sent her students over to Cornell. In her mind, the purpose was to hold the door open until other people opened it wider. And once that happened, it was done. The infirmary persisted for a century. The DNA of it is still somewhere in the Weill, Cornell, Columbia, NYU nexus. But yeah, so that's what happened to the college. Who was their mother? Yes, everybody assumes that in order to have this extraordinary family, that the matriarch must have been impressive. I think actually in this case, the inspiration came from the father. Hannah Blackwell mostly worried a lot that her children were all going to hell. Her letters are all laced with, how is your soul? She was an excellent mother, but I don't think she was the intellectual inspiration for them. I think their father started that, and then they egged each other on. Their letters about her have a very familiar ring to anyone who's ever struggled with a parent. They're kind of like, they sort of, volleyball her from home to home. So. Is that it for you?
So let's give another round of applause for Brandon. All right. I just wanted to thank Janice Nomura again for coming out to Upstate. Thank you everyone for coming. And again, thank you, President Dewan, for your support. Janice will be doing the book signing right outside, and then we'll also have box lunches available set out. So feel free to grab one on your way out. Thank you for coming.
I'm sorry.